This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. This is our second video in our series Stewardship in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. And it is our second video. Last one was in these two chapters, what is hospitality? Here, in this one, it's going to be on gratitude. And there's a lot going on with gratitude throughout the New Testament as expressed in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. And you'll recall that 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 is where Paul is asking for support and talking about prior support he had received elsewhere and framing it in a framework there's no other word for than stewardship. And to understand it, we need to understand gratitude a little bit. So before we get into 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, first is to understand what is Paul up to here. And there's a few things about gratitude. That one thing is sort of obvious about gratitude, that it has nothing to do with wealth or status. Meaning, obviously, it's not prosperity gospel, as if to say, we're only thankful if we're doing really well, that we're wealthy and therefore we're generous, nor that we're an elite person or not. Gratitude is something much more foundational, but to understand it, we need to understand it in a larger sense. The word for giving thanks, charis, is the same term for grace, another word for gift, and thanks, which sort of makes sense if you think about it. Gift and thanks are sort of related. That is, when I receive a gift, I provide thanks. Now, there's a lot going on here that could be one construct. I think most people in America don't think of those as one construct. But in the New Testament, it is, because gratitude is primarily about relationship. And this is very important, meaning what is it that's the relationship between the giver and the receiver that leads to gratitude? Well, it's not a point action, it is a relational component, but it is very active. And that, more than anything, it is an ethic. How do I behave when I have received a gift? That's, in the New Testament, the cause for thanks is a reception of a gift. How do I behave? What do I do? That's what makes it an ethic. This is different from a modern sensibility because it is not only an attitude. There is a very positive aspect of an attitude that is what gratitude is. However, it's not only that. There is an active component. Thanking is something one does. And so, instead, how do we live and how does this relationship play out? Well, here, let's turn to 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. Because when Paul talks about gratitude and generosity, because he is asking for support for his mission, and that if you support his mission, you're part of that mission, you're part of the relationship between you and Paul. But then his case is very interesting because he points out that Christ, though rich, became poor. Now that seems like a little bit of, what is he doing? Giving them a guilt trip that, be like Christ who was rich and made himself poor? But maybe not if we look more carefully. Because he further says that this is not about more than you have. And it is not about that it is we shall be deprived and they shall have. That's not the goal of this. The goal, he does use the language of equality. That is to say, and what we would probably want to call equity, that is to say, so that all will have enough. We'll get back to gratitude. At first, this doesn't sound like gratitude at all, except when we look at it and we say, what's our ethic? How do we act? How do we give thanks for the gifts we've received from God? Well, it is, yes, through generosity, but also to say the goal is for all us to have enough. Not for you to give more than you have, not for you to end up becoming poor so other people can become rich, but instead, there is a more dramatic dynamic going on. Dynamic going on here. Because what eventually is giving thanks? Well, grace, charis, helps us again. Because how did grace work? Well, if there is God, and here am I receive grace from God. I didn't do anything, I've just received it. And that grace that I have received is alive in me and moves outwardly to others. It is me recognizing who is God and who am I. That which I have is all a gift from God, and so I cannot help but give thanks. And the thanks I give is the relationship I have with God. It's not as if I don't give thanks, I don't receive the gifts. That's not the point at all. We have received, and so therefore we respond. There's another word for this, which is worship. When I know who I am and I know who God is and I know the correct order. And so that is the active component of gratitude. That here in worship, then this very grace I have pushes itself outward. Luther would even point out, we're not really the one doing it. It is still God's action. That it's still, we've just become, that's what we mean by the means of grace. Being the means of grace to others is an expression of gratitude. And so, then, what does Paul say with this model in mind? You, Corinthians, your generous act will cause them to give thanks to God. Why? Shouldn't they give thanks to you? No, because of this dynamic. That's gratitude. It's not just the gratitude of those others who've received grace from you. It is you extending and allowing that grace to live within you. And if it is alive within you, it is moving and active. And so, what this call of gratitude is it is the call to be responsive in an active relationship. An active relationship with God, because grace and thanks are related. This is something Lutherans struggle with because we never want any idea that we're doing something to receive grace, or else grace wouldn't be grace. That's true, but have we forgotten what our calling is? It's another term that's very important here. Our calling to one another, and there is an aspect of that uniquely, the way we give thanks to God is not just upward to God, but outward to others. And that's where this up and out thing fails, this metaphor. It's not really up and it's not really out. The very worship of God is our care for one another. The very action of gratitude to God is its expression outwardly. And I can't draw that very well. But that's the fundamental idea of gratitude that Paul is drawing upon here in 2 Corinthians. Look for next week at the conclusion of this, where we talk about Paul's discussion of abundance and the way in which abundance is tied to this point of equality and having enough. Look forward to that in the coming videos. I'm Pastor Ben.